are listening to the SecureWorld Sessions, a cybersecurity podcast that gives you access.
Access granted.
Access to people and ideas that inspire and inform. Hello and welcome to episode 51 of the Remote Sessions podcast. I'm Bruce Sussman, your host and director of content here at SecureWorld, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. We're talking to Julia Voo, who's one of the researchers and creators of the new National Cyber Power Index for 2020. Now, this is the first of its kind, all-of-country approach to looking at cyber power. And by the way, Julia and her other researchers are with the Harvard Kennedy School, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Now, it's conference season where we're having virtual SecureWorld conferences across North America, and Julia was the closing keynote at SecureWorld Detroit-Toronto-Cincinnati. So, part presentation and part fireside chat with yours truly. Let's go to the conference and hear more about who has cyber power, how do you measure it, and who truly is on the list of most powerful cyber nations in cyberspace.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for inviting me to share our research. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity, and I'm going to try my best to be engaging because I know you guys have had a really long day with all this great content. So firstly, as Bruce mentioned, this is the first comprehensive measurement of cyber power at the national level. We look at the cyber power of 30 countries using 32 intent indicators and 27 capability indicators. All of this is based on open source data. And this is created by an amazing team of practitioners, academics, and also cyber threat analysts at the Belfer Center. So here's the team. I just wanted to put their wonderful faces in front of you. It's not just me. So from left to right, there's Alsan Hamani, Simon Jones, Winona DeSomba, Daniel Cassidy, and Ian Schwarzenbach. Real mix of expertise, as I mentioned, government, private sector, academia, and we have... Oopsie daisy. Sorry. This is my dog. We've been working on this for the past year. Right. So let me go to the next slide. So let me tell you a little bit of the genesis of where this has come from. So one of the reasons why this idea came about was because I was basically having a conversation with a member of the team, and we were wondering, why is it that people think that the US, China, Russia, Israel, and the UK are the cyber superpowers? This was over a year ago. And we're like, what makes them super? What is the threshold? Who's number 6, right? And there's also this idea of these powers is these specific countries being the main actors in the area. It's perpetuated by the media focus on some operations. So there's the WannaCry, DPRK, US Israel Stuxnet stuff, the disinformation campaigns around the 2016 elections. But we couldn't really put down specific criteria or identify who had measured this in the first place. So that was what we decided to explore. And initially I was saying to my colleague, this will be fine. We can write it up in a month, just two of us. But here we are, 6 brains, 1 year later, and we finally got something to share with you. So, the traditional definition of cyber power is quite focused on offensive capabilities. And for us, that didn't seem to capture the whole spectrum of what you can do with cyber capabilities. We recognize that they're very horizontal. It didn't seem like this focus really did it justice or explained a lot of other activity that's going on at the international level by state actors, and there was no clear explanation of how they're all related to each other. So how are tech exports related to this? How does GDPR affect this? And, why do, foreign offices and state departments bother to have bilateral or regional cyber dialogues with other countries? What benefit does that give them? And, what are they trying to achieve? So we have, we're trying to develop a framework that captured the multi-use nature of cyber power, reflecting its complexity, and we wanted to create a tool that would be useful for policymakers, because we thought that having a clearer conceptualization of what states can do with these capabilities would help make better policy, basically. So we started thinking, how can we make the most holistic assessment of what's going on? So we looked at over hundreds of attacks that have been conducted by state actors over the past decade, many of which have been collected by other brilliant researchers, particularly like the Council on Foreign Relations. And through looking at these attributed attacks, we were able to identify about 8 objectives. And these are surveilling domestic groups, enhancing national cyber defenses, controlling the information environment, intelligence gathering for national security, growing national cyber and technology competence, destroying or disabling an adversary's capabilities, amassing wealth and extracting cryptocurrency, and finally also states seeking to define international cyber norms and technical standards. And we recognize that states aren't pursuing all of these objectives, and if they are pursuing them, they're all pursuing them to different degrees of success. The NCPI, our index, is the first index to try and consider the country's intent before calculating its capabilities. And so here's a really terrible table for you. I'm sorry about that, but if you want to look at it more closely, it's in the PDF of the report. But so we started to try and figure out, okay, so we know that there are about these 8 objectives out there. How can we measure the 30 countries in our list? Like, how can we figure out what they're trying to achieve now? So to do that, Dan and Simon scoured over 1,000 data sources, including, government strategy documents, other speeches, and not just the military side, but other related policies, to figure out what the governments say that they want to achieve now. And so this table shows you the types of questions that we were asking under each objective. Another aspect of this is that we tried to assess the quality of their cyber strategies. And to do this, we used a framework that has been, or guidance that's been published by the United Nations and other respectable institutions like the European Union, to assess how comprehensive the cyber strategy is, how long have they been pursuing those objectives, do they update these strategies regularly, have they dedicated resources to this. So that was part of the intent analysis. And then we go to the capabilities. So at this point, we kind of figured out what the countries want to achieve, or they say they want to achieve using cyber means. And then we're like, okay, so do they have the capabilities to do this? And sorry, this is another terrible table, but you can look at it in more, for a PowerPoint. It's much better in PDF. It's on page 38. I think this table is really interesting because what it shows you, I think, is how we've tried to capture the multi-use nature of these different cyber capabilities. So on the left-hand column are the 27 indicators that we use, and then the little crosses are under which objective we think they contribute to. And so if you have a look at that, you can understand how some of the indicators that we've used appear under multiple objectives. I think it really shows the horizontal nature of cyber capabilities and why it's really important to have a good understanding of a country's intent. And, you can't score highly in our overall NCPI unless you have both high intent and demonstrated capability. So just to articulate that more succinctly, what is cyber power? It's the intent to pursue multiple national objectives using cyber means, and also the capabilities to achieve those objectives. And this is just a formulaic representation of what it is for us. So it's not just pointy, offensive stuff. We have identified 8 objectives, although this one only measures 7, which I can explain a bit later on. And we consider the overall measure of cyber power as capability times intent. Oh, sorry. Whoop-a-daisy. Let me catch up slides. I'm really bad. I'm sorry, Bruce. I apologize. Here's the next one, the one I was talking about the definition. And here's the equation. Okay. Now I'm all caught up. And so then finally, here are the top 10 for us this year. And so this top 10 is the combined assessment of the intent and capability across all of the 7 objectives to give you our top 10 of who is the most comprehensive cyber power. We prefer to use the word comprehensive and not superpower. So from 1 to 10, number 1 is the US, number 2 is China, number 3 is the UK, 4 Russia, the 5 Netherlands, 6 France, 7 Germany, 8 Canada, 9 Japan, and 10 Australia. In our paper, we also include the top 10 purely for intent for each objective, and also the top 10 for capability as well for each objective. As Bruce mentioned, this is hot off the press. It's been covered quite broadly in the media. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about this because I think it's really interesting to see how it's been received because, there's been one, it's the first kind of comprehensive measure of cyber power of its kind. And it's challenged also a lot of people's perceptions of what cyber power means, because ours is a holistic definition. It includes 7 different objectives. It's not just the pointy stuff. So there was a bit of focus in the media on the US-China, great power politics, and also the fact that both of those countries topped the index is of no surprise, but that was interesting for many. But I think what is also interesting for other people is, that India ranks quite lowly on our annex, that Netherlands is number 5, and also this kind of broader definition of cyber power, that it's not like cyber. We've got to think about the lexicon a bit. There's this title here on the bottom left-hand side around digital dominance. So perhaps with this multi-use nature, it's more accurate to describe it as a digital power. So, this is just some of the main points that people have been discussing, and also the absence of Israel in the top 10 as well as the DPRK. And I think we started a really important conversation, and we've been really excited to get the feedback from the community on, what has been useful about this framework, what else we could add in NCPI 2021, a discussion of why some powers are up there and others aren't. And so I would love to hear from the SecureWorld audience. If you ever have any feedback about this, please do reach out. Yes. So that was my quick overview of our research. I'm very happy to hand back over to Bruce to have a bit more of a discussion.
Yes, well, that was a great overview, Julia. Thank you. And I've got questions for our fireside chat portion of the presentation here. The first thing is, just remind me again, because I have seen other indices about who's the most powerful and why in cyberspace. Why is it that you decided to take this approach versus the approach of others? What's the contrast there?
There are several cyber-related indices out there. The UN's International Telecommunications Union, they look at cybersecurity only. Others look at purely the commercial power. There are none out there that look at the offensive capabilities and none that consider intent. And we thought that was really an important element to capture because of the horizontal nature of cyber capabilities, because they can be applied in lots of different contexts. So we need to understand what it is that the actor wants to do. And also there didn't seem to be a consensus around what it means. So despite the fact that there are cyber-related indices existing, it didn't seem to have really united everyone in like a shared idea. So that's what we really wanted to achieve by doing this.
Cool. Okay, that's great. That's fantastic. A couple of questions that come to mind, and I know it's in your report as you detailed things, but can you explain to our audience, for example, how are China and Russia wielding their cyber power? What kind of power do they have? What are concerns you have around the powers they have? And what does that look like from a China and Russia perspective? Because I think those of us in the West are obviously concerned if those powers are used against us. So what are you finding there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so actually, China ranks very highly over our overall index. It's second to the US, as mentioned, and Russia's up there as well. So I don't think there are any surprises really, particularly for like this on those two countries. I would say that the kinds of activity that concern me the most, and this isn't restricted to China and Russia only per se, but I know that they particularly like to use these types of operations, are disinformation and misinformation. And that mainly worries me because of the policy response that would be required to defend against it is just such a slow burner. It's an insidious tool, like really kind of going in and like dividing like the psyche in a way that it's very hard to remedy at the national level, apart from self-education and raising awareness. Like that seems to be like the kind of remedy that I think of now, but that's also just a very slow solution. So that's the kind of activity that scares me the most.
Mm-hmm. And do you think like the U.S. and the UK and Canada, are we using our cyber powers for good or for bad? Or does your index even rank that or consider that? Maybe it's just about the raw nature of the power.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting question. Yes, and I think that what we've tried to do with our index is show the duality of cyber power. And so actually with the 7 objectives that we have, they can be for good and bad, right? So for example, the surveilling and monitoring domestic groups, that's one of our objectives. And like the way we describe this objective is, a country has taken steps to give itself the legal permissions and cyber surveillance capabilities to monitor, detect, and gather intelligence on domestic threats and actors. And, this could be surveilling its own citizens, or other kind of threat actors within the country, also monitoring internet traffic. So that can be used for good and bad, right? And the fact that, across our objectives, like in the top 5, we have these US, China, UK, and countries that are using the same capabilities for very different outcomes. I think we try to stay away from the moral, the good and bad of using cyber capabilities. So I think this is a reflection of what states could do if they wanted to or have done.
More of my conversation with Julia right after this.
Today's podcast is all about power rankings, and here's one you should also know about: Trend Micro's Cyber Risk Index. It is the source for today's Trend Micro Top 3. Number 1, the Trend Micro Cyber Risk Index is at an elevated risk level for US-based organizations. Number 2, the Cyber Risk Index compares how prepared an organization is to attack against the current threat landscape. Number 3, according to the index, 8 out of 10 organizations expect to be breached in the next 12 months. There is a link to the index in the show notes, and thanks again to Trend Micro for being our premier podcast partner.
Now let's go back to our conversation with Julia Voo from the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. One of the surprises that hit me when I looked through it is that Israel came in at number 11 in cyber power. And, Israel has a lot of cyber talent. They've got a booming cybersecurity industry. What was the reason Israel came in relatively low compared to some of these other countries?
So I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that, as I mentioned, like this kind of narrow definition of cyber power, although, a lot of that includes both offensive capabilities and also its kind of really strong commercial sector. There are other aspects to our definition as well, including, setting norms. But also we measure, you can only score highly in our index if you demonstrate strong intent and capability. And so in terms of the strategy documents and the policy side of assessing Israel's intent, is not very clear from the documents that the government has produced. And so that's one of the reasons why Israel isn't up there. And we agree that that's one of the anomalies of our index. So that's something. I think another thing to highlight is that our data set is based on open source material, right? So I'm sure there's lots of information that the audience has out there that's super interesting, but if it was plugged into our framework, you might have a slightly different ranking up there. But it's really just based on the data that we could access.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Absolutely. Okay. Another surprise, I think, is Estonia has been seen by many, in the cybersecurity community as a model around, digital innovation, and then also cybersecurity is this beacon, and they certainly got publicity that way on worldwide headlines. But Estonia came in 14th. What do you think the reason for that might be? Were you surprised by that too? That's the other thing.
Yeah, we were, because, 14th, Estonia is always kind of put up there as a really good example of a country that is trying to adapt to these and use these modern technologies in a way that's really helpful for public services, and also its track record of cyber operations. But also, 14th is pretty good for a country of 1.3 million. But on capability, Estonia is top 10 for intelligence and also offense. Yeah, I think Estonia is very well known for its kind of digital public services, and that's actually not something that was measured in our index. So I think, if we had included that indicator, then countries like Estonia and perhaps also Singapore would also be a bit higher, because we know that they have these really comprehensive, anecdotally, we know that they have these really strong services.
Okay, great. And then my last country-specific question is around Canada. Came in number 8, so solidly in the top 10. We have a lot of members, Canadian citizens on the conference broadcast today. Where do you think Canada shines when it comes to cyber power?
Yeah. So for us, Canada, for capability, they were top 10 for surveillance, for defense, for the information control, and also offense. So 4 out of 7 is pretty strong. I was surprised that they weren't in the top 10 for norms. So for us, that's activity at the UNGGE, at the International Telecommunications Union, at the International Organization for Standards, in comparison to other countries. So I think I would suggest that might be somewhere to look if they were seeking to influence or enhance its influence in norms. But yeah, really strong actually, I think. Top 10 and 4 of 7 is great.
Yeah, that's great. That is. Okay, fantastic. All right. One thing that was missing from the report, and I'm going to quote your report because you guys talked about this. Your report says, and this is quoting here, "We also strongly believe that amassing wealth or extracting cryptocurrency is a top objective of some countries and that they employ cyber means to achieve it." So you believe that, and your research team stated that. But if that's true, why did you leave that factor out of your cyber power index?
Yeah, thank you. Eagle eyes, Bruce. And also,
I caught you guys. I caught you.
And it's also like it gives me the opportunity to explain this point that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, which is like, this is the 8th objective. This is the 8th objective that we didn't include finally because, there's 7 objectives. And so this was a really big conversation in the team. We had a lot of pretty heated debates about this project. One of the reasons why we couldn't include it was because of the quality of the data out there. So for all of the indicators, the 27 indicators in our index, there had to be a threshold of 70%, which meant that we had data for 21 of the 30 countries. And so for this specific, or like a good proxy. And so for this specific indicator, we just couldn't get the data on 21 of those countries. There's like lots of stuff out there on DPRK, right? So if we'd include it, it would have like massively skewed the index. So we think it's a really important, element or angle of or use of cyber capabilities that countries are pursuing. And we really want to include it in future iterations, but we couldn't include it this time around because it just didn't meet our threshold.
Mm-hmm.
However,
okay, great. Yes.
Know anyone who knows that data, Bruce?
We might have some people. Excellent. All right. That's good. If you've got that data, you know how to reach Julia. That'll be great. I did want to ask you about the United States. And I was thinking about there are areas where the United States didn't come in first place, even though overall we are the U.S. is, according to your ranking, the most powerful cyber power. There are areas where China and Russia in particular, I'm thinking of, topped the U.S. Can you talk about any of those findings? You may not remember all those details, but can you unpack that just a little bit?
One of the things I think is really important to highlight about that, we look at defense, right? I think China tops defense, actually, and I think this might be a good angle on this. So one of the really interesting things about our index is that an indicator in one objective can be a strength and a weakness in another. So on defense, for us, I would say that, connectivity, the population's connected to the internet. For us, that's very high for information control. It means that, for us, that kind of meant that the country could, collect a lot of data, has a really good idea of what's going on in its information environment. But for us on the defense side, that same indicator creates a massive attack surface. So for us, that's a huge weakness. And I think the way that the US has a decentralized, internet, much more open than, for example, countries like China and Russia. Therefore, I think it's just much harder to defend. So that's that's kind of how I would explain that difference.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so I know there were some other examples that you brought up. Okay, on the surveillance and monitoring domestic groups, this is an example that you've brought up. There has been talk around the world, of course, about various governments and their powers to surveil. Is the ability to surveil domestic groups, is that a strength? Is that a weakness? Is that good or bad? How do you see that, or how would you answer a question like that?
Well, I think in that top 5 for that, there's countries that are authoritarian and also democratic. Is it the US tops that one? China number 2?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on whether or not there's the regulatory framework in place to protect citizens. Is it transparent? Is there a way for appeal? What is it being used for? And that's something that our index doesn't calculate. It looks at whether or not it wants to, and there's demonstrated operations that it has. But we don't really make that judgment on whether or not it's good or bad. But obviously, it could be used for either.
Okay, excellent. Well, that's good. I can see how that can be, like you were talking about earlier, that duality. So that's very interesting. in particular about China, one of the notes that you made was that China is gunning to be number one. And I realize this may not be a surprise, right, to any of us in this audience. But are there areas where you see China really making great strides, even though they're already considered a cyber superpower or what have you, where they're still striving to continue to excel or top the world, if I could put it that way?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So China's been super transparent about its intention to develop global world-leading capabilities in various areas of technology for more than the past decade, outlined in several strategy plans all over the place and speeches. It's very clear that that's what their intention is. And also they've dedicated a huge amount of resources, funding. There's a very close public-private partnership that, state-owned enterprises, etc. Actually, I think on the Chinese side, they have, because of its centralized government, I think it's managed to really kind of pull these different resources together that you need, I think, to develop the capabilities in all these different sectors. Because they can influence education policy and subsidies for companies, blah, blah, blah. And so one of the areas and China has excelled in all of these objectives, right, and developed very strong capabilities across the board. One of the areas that I'm very interested in thinking about what China's doing is at the international kind of norms level, because you typically don't, I think you would say, the US and other kind of Western European countries are very good at influencing the kind of global standards and the norms about how things should be done. But actually, if we look at and they still are, but if we look at statistics over the past few years or decades on how China and other countries as well have invested in growing its influence in different organizations, in a way that is perfectly in line of these processes, using these systems actually quite smartly and in a quite sophisticated way. I think that's a really interesting indication of how it seeks not only to have the kind of hard power of the industry, but also the principles and the values influencing that globally. And we can also see that not just in international organizations, but also in the way that it's influencing developing markets in adopting its Chinese manufactured technology as well. That's a huge amount of leverage, soft power. I think that China has done quite well in that space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt about that. Okay, very interesting. Well, Julia, I'm wondering, I know your research has made quite a splash, and it's garnered headlines and publicity really around the globe as everybody talks about where their country is, right, in relation to the Cyber Power Index. Is that what's been most rewarding for you about this research, or would you say is tops for you having done this project with your team?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It really was a passion project, I mean, this is something all the best ideas, Bruce, they come from when you're having a drink with a friend. And so
that's been known to happen, yes.
Having a chat with my friend, and then, we had really smart people just floating around the Belfer Center who were willing to just be intellectually who are intellectually creative, and we just kind of went down this route, even though we were initially, I was like, this is going to take us a month. And then the more I started talking to my smart team members, I was like, oh gosh, this is hard. Now I know why no one's done this. We find it really validating, our efforts, that people are now having this conversation, and that we've created a starting point, and I think a pretty smart framework to think about it. It's also quite creative. This kind of intent and capability hasn't been used in other types of indices for measuring traditional power like military. So I think it's we're really proud of like the creativity of it, and also how I think we're now going to see more conversation about this and like better research. We've also made our data like publicly available because we want others to build on what we've done. So we're very excited.
Cool. Okay, that's great. And then Julia, what do you hope that this accomplishes? Because obviously you put a lot of work into it. What do you hope that it helps, governments and organizations do? What are you trying? What will be the benefit here, do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a couple of things. I think one is that we have provided a framework for countries to think about developing kind of all-of-nation capabilities in a more comprehensive way. Often countries have published, cyber security strategies as opposed to one strategy that kind of covers the whole of it's more horizontal in nature. And so I think that's one thing is we provided this framework that can help them think about it. I think the other is also that I hope that we've shone a light on the fact that it is quite actually helpful to be a bit more transparent about the kind of capabilities that are out there. I think demonstrated by the fact that we have 27 indicators. It would be great if there were like more, because a better understanding and clarity in a space that's quite opaque, I think makes the risk for escalation less, potentially. So I hope that is one of the outcomes, that people become more transparent about certain aspects of their capabilities, but also to broaden the conversation, because one of the reasons why I started this as like formerly research director for China Cyber is that I was just like, why there is a focus on China and some countries in a way that can, I think, put blinders on policymakers who should be thinking more broadly about other actors as well.
That's fantastic, actually, and I'm sorry to step on your comment at the end there, but I was thinking about that idea that I've heard some of our guests in the last couple of years say, yes, these are the top cyber powers that we need to worry about, but there are many more nations gaining and building great cyber power that could be used, right, for good or for evil. So it sounds like that's what you were driving toward there.
Yeah, for good, for evil, and like if we know about like alliance building or other like trading alternatives, like there's so many ways this information can be used. I agree.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Julia Voo, Cyber Fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Thanks so much for being here and sharing about your new National Cyber Power Index. We really appreciate you.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
Now, even with all the conversation we've had here on the podcast and at the virtual conference, we have only scratched the surface for this National Cyber Power Index. So if you'd like more, there's a link in the show notes for you to check out. And it goes country by country with who's got the power and who doesn't, who's coming up, who's going down, all that stuff. So check it out. Also, I want to say thank you to Trend Micro for being our premier podcast partner. And that'll do it for episode 51. It's in the record books. As we say, we just made broadcast history. We broadcast this episode, and now it's history. So thanks for being with us wherever you are, working in the yard, doing the dishes, whatever. We appreciate you being here. And be sure and let others know, will you, about this podcast if you've enjoyed the content that we've brought you week after week. On behalf of the SecureWorld team, I'm Bruce Sussman, host of the SecureWorld Sessions, and let's catch up again on Tuesday.